Could everyone please mute themselves? So my name is Samhar Johannes, and I, along with my colleagues, Susan Graham, Emily Colon, and Jasmine Shoemaker, we coordinate the Spotlight Guest Instructor Workshop Series. In this series, we invite university community members and friends to share their research and creative endeavors in a one-hour talk hosted virtually. Today, we have Laura Torres Vargas, a graduate student in the GES department. Her research focuses on migration, violence, gender studies, and Latin American studies. In her master thesis at UMBC, she examined the gender representations of migrant Venezuelan women in Colombian and Venezuelan newspapers from 2015 to 2020. She used discourse analysis as her primary methodology due to the impact of COVID. Currently, she is studying migrant Venezuelan women movements from Venezuela to Colombia, then to the US, focusing on different gender-structured violence, political violence, migratory movements, and community building. Her presentation today is titled Gender-Structured Representations of the Migrant Venezuelan Women in Colombian and Venezuelan Newspapers during the 2015 to 2020 period. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. I am going to start presenting or sharing my presentation. So thank you so much for that presentation. I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. If so, can someone say yes, please?
Yes.
Thank you. So as as I already said, my name is Laura Torres. I am currently a PhD student in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems. I'm going to be presenting my master thesis research, and I'm trying to be the best as I can to share with you all what I have learned through this process. So with that said, my outline, sorry. Last thing, this is Venezuela, as you can see here. This is Venezuela. This is Colombia, this is USA, and this is the American continent, just for us to have an idea where Venezuela is located. And when I'm talking about Venezuelan and Colombian migration, is from Venezuela to Colombia, which is this country. So this is going to be my outline. So for now, I'm going to be talking about the introduction. So the migratory process of women in general is influenced and dominated by several aspects of gender structures, creating different contexts for the migrant woman, which can be listed as migration webs and caregiving for their families, power relations and social complexity, violent context, and political situation that results in migratory flows. In the Venezuelan case, the political and economic structures by having economic embargoes enforced by the USA, in addition to the economic resources that are being misused by giving subsidies, even though the country has not reached an economic stability. This, in addition to the economic deficiency, increased unemployment rates, escalations in violence, and food deficits have created a context that forced Venezuelan women to migrate. This is a map a little bit more easy to understand. Again, this is Venezuela, this is Colombia. The migration is being considered through the following perspectives in my research, as a crisis, body and border, citizenship, international relations, gender perspectives. All of these concepts help to understand the discourse power-knowledge relation and how these affect the Venezuelan women's migration process and experiences. So by 2020, the Venezuelan had a 5 million 667,000 Venezuelan leaving their country. And the increase by years of Venezuelan migrants is being shown in this graphic, where from 2017 to 2020, the number of Venezuelan women and men increased in a way that by 2020, the number almost reached the 2 millions of Venezuelans in Colombia. And how we can see here, the blue color represents the Venezuelan women, and the orange color represents the Venezuelan men. In 2020, the Venezuelan women were a little bit more migrants in Colombia than what were the men, but usually they were very equal. So the anti-migrant discourse and politics. So this is being used to eliminate the possibility of the other. In this case, the other is the Venezuelan migrant as someone that can contribute to the country. And this is done by the limitation of the free migratory flows by creating specialized border policing, border walls, and unfavorable propaganda and other aspects that will limit the Venezuelan women to migrate to Colombia. In this case, of Colombia and Venezuela, the anti-migratory discourse has been reproduced in the newspapers, and it has had a strong impact in the way the Venezuelan women are being perceived by the local community. This discourse has influenced politics of ID requirements and legal documents to enter to Colombia, which were not a requirement before because of a Colombian, Venezuelan, and Comunidad Andina trade that allows people to move between countries in South America without the requirement of a passport or a visa, but just like a national ID. Nowadays, because of these discourses of anti-migratory propaganda, people from Venezuela have to have a permit to enter to Colombia. That's why this is so important. So my research question and main claim are, the question is how El Tiempo, Cuestión Pública, El Nacional, El Universal newspapers represent the Venezuelan woman during the migration process to Colombia in the last 5 years, that is from 2015 to 2020. And my main argument is that news media frame Venezuelan women in limited and inaccurate ways. For instance, several newspapers from both Colombia and Venezuela focus on women's sexuality and do not depict Venezuelan women as capable professionals. Such discourse matter as these justify anti-migrant policies, including closing borders and requiring of IDs to cross the border, as well as strict health policies, among others. Also, the discourse allow to obtain international aid, which is selectively given as a temporary shelter, serving as a band-aid for the deeper wound, which is the problematic of why they are migrating, right? So now I'm going to be talking about my methodology. So the methodology, as already introduced, I use critical discourse analysis, and this is an analytical research method that considers different ways of representation and their contribution to issues like social, power, abuse, dominance, and inequality that are reproduced in articles and media material that affect the social and political context. This method further focuses on the direct political and social powers that are being presented in relation with the Venezuelan women's migration process and their impact in the reader's perception of the group of study. In this search is this search is based on the post-structuralism and Orientalism theories on feminist approach to knowledge, having Said and Foucault as the main authors. Sade and Foucault ideas of power in relation to knowledge and discourse are being applied in this research by understanding the ways in which the newspapers reproduce profiles of Venezuelan women and are not coherent, accurate, and specific characteristics that do not fully represent the reality of general population of the Venezuelans. The microscale on my research is the analysis is being recognized by the feminist approach to the critical discourse analysis that recognize gender differences and structure in the discourse. And in addition, the knowledge of race in the discipline is guided by Black geographies. So the population of study are the Venezuelan women that have migrated from Venezuela to Colombia over the period of 2015 to 2020, studying women's migration in Latin America entails studying the acceptance of migratory flows and how they affect in women's lives, and the media reporting and sharing their experiences through the migration process are within the focus of this work. Based on the aforementioned, this research makes use of critical discourse analysis of newspapers articles published by 4 newspapers where the population study is always represented and referred to as a woman that have migrated from Venezuela to Colombia during this time period. So I have used 4 newspapers. I have divided them by mainstream and independent newspapers, and I had 4 specific characteristics that I was looking into these newspapers. So first is that they had a balanced perspective on the Venezuelan women's migration in the independent and the mainstream newspapers. Second was the provision of large and enough number of published articles related to the research topic during the period of 2015 to 2020. Third was the articles must be publicly available because of COVID. In this time, I wasn't able to go to Colombia nor to Venezuela to recollect the articles physically. So I had to look at the ability on online newspapers. And for the location and language, my first language is Spanish, therefore for me it was more easy to read any of the articles because in Colombia and in Venezuela they speak Spanish. So my data set of articles was as this. So independent newspapers, I had Question Pública from Colombia with 7 articles, and I had El Universal from Venezuela with 36 articles. And in the mainstream newspapers, I had El Tiempo from Colombia with 205 articles, and El Nacional in Venezuela with 74 articles, for a total of 322 articles. In this, in me getting all the documents and the data that I needed to analyze, I came across a understanding that Venezuela, because of the crisis that they are at in that moment, newspapers were also having a crisis because of the politics and the lack of paper too. So that's why there is a big gap between the mainstream newspaper in Venezuela and the mainstream newspaper in Colombia, where there is over 100 articles more in El Tiempo than in the mainstream in El Nacional. So I use different techniques of analysis for my research in order to have the discourse analysis. This suggests that the data, once the data was recollected, a series of questions were done, and this is called like 5 W's and how. And from those 5 W's and how, I came with the questions of how is being the principal actor selected and presented in these news articles, what is being said, what is not being said, why is this being said, where is the time frame and what is implied by common intertextuality by a specific place and time context in the selected newspaper articles. When are the acts happening in selected news articles, and how is the people being portrayed? Now I'm going to be talking about my fundings. So I have, because of the many fundings I looked at, I created 3 main categories where I could see the different fundings. The first category is Venezuelans and their opportunities in Colombia. The second one is the perceptions of Venezuelan women's sexuality. And the last one is the different types of violence encountered by Venezuelan women. Sorry, I'm going to drink water. So in the first one is the Venezuelan woman in search for opportunities. In this one, it is important to recognize that Venezuela is a country that has changed from capitalism to social bolívarism during the past 20 years, and that in a macro scale of international relations has resulted in a micro scale of migratory flows to other countries due to the lack of resources or to the not alienation with the political movements that are happening in the country. So as mentioned before, the economic decline has generated an instability and polarization in sectors of the Venezuelan society, generated dissatisfaction and urgency to migrate to meet their needs. And lastly, the Migration Minister of Colombia revealed that between 2015 and 2020, more than 2 million of Venezuelans were in the Colombian territory under the status of refugee, migrant, resident, or undocumented. Then from this first category, I will look at migration and legalization. So in this subcategory, I was looking at 69 articles where the Venezuelan migration is presented as a human crisis and creating a narrative that helps the country to take actions, and by allowing other countries such as USA to have a role in the decision making over the migration acceptance and management in Colombia. This was seen in articles with the headlines of Ivanka Trump is coming to Colombia and give $200,000 to help with the Venezuelan crisis. And then we will see like the pictures of Ivanka Trump there giving the money, right? Or going to the refugees, or going to community centers where the Venezuelan people were located at. This international aid is being presented mostly through the US concerns for the Colombian government in their dealing with the migration flows, which are entitled to create an image of the USA and Colombia as countries that are taking care of the migratory community. This imaginary can be used to create an environment where countries with established democracies like USA direct the migratory flows to other countries. And in that sense, the flows are not going to have them as a principal destination. So by receiving this economic help, the Colombian government creates these refuges where they are locating the Venezuelan migrants, right? And by the Colombian government having those those places, they are also helping in an indirect way that those migrants don't move up north to the USA. So it's a win-win. Colombian newspapers are portraying the government as a hero, and Venezuelan newspapers are neglecting their responsibility and not recognizing the migratory process of the community. So I find that very interesting, where the Colombian newspapers mainly they show Colombian state as the hero because it's creating these international relations to help the Venezuelan community that is migrating to Colombia. But in the other hand, we see the Venezuelan newspapers saying like we are not the ones. They are not people migrating from Venezuela to any place. We are okay. There is nothing happening in Venezuela. The nationality takes place in the body of a migrant as a type of border at the same state must control through norms. This is an idea that Michel Foucault also represents in the biopolitics. So yeah, it's this one. So that means that the border is being brought in the body of the people. Therefore, even though they are nation sisters, I will explain a little bit more. They are always going to be a Venezuelan person that is in a Colombian space. Therefore, there will be always like that limitation of, oh, but you are Venezuelan, so you cannot work on these things, or you are Venezuelan, so therefore you cannot have access of these benefits that just only Colombians have. So that's the idea of bringing the border in your body. So transnational communities, this is a important term because in Colombia, as I showed before, and Venezuela, they share frontiers and they share a very long frontier. There are different transnational communities that are between those frontiers. And when the borders were closed, those transnational communities were facing a problem, which was that many people that live in Colombia used to go and work in Venezuela, and many people that live in Venezuela used to go and shop in Colombia, right? But when the border is closed, those regular relations with the space were violated, and they had to start looking at places and spaces where they could interact with, in this case, their economy, or going to school, or sometimes even like transnational communities have families, members that they live in two places at the same time. So the closure of borders also affected those relations with their families. The other discourse that was seen here was security and safety discourse. So usually they present this as people from Venezuela migrating to Colombia just to take their jobs, to take their food, to take even their health benefits, when isn't that true? So those discourses create this idea of, oh, well, the state, the Colombian state, have to help into regulating who is coming from Venezuela and what are their desires on coming to Colombia, and if they are going to be able to accept or to take anything from us, how is that going to be regulated? And then I also saw the regulation and control as biopower. Again, this is an idea of Michel Foucault, and this regulation and control in biopower was more guided, and I will go a little bit deep on this in the next section, on controlling women's body and their reproduction and their sexuality, by saying, because you're a woman, you will act in some ways, or because you're a woman from Venezuela, you only do these things, such as sexual work, or being pregnant, or going for specific clinical process that they cannot go in Venezuela because of the health crisis. And then the final thing that I saw here in this idea of border and body was the representation of a state as a caregiver. So it will always show that Colombia was that hero, that state hero that was very willing to care for the migrants coming to the land, and that Venezuela was not that caregiver state because it wasn't ensuring for women to have health in the different ways they needed during their pregnancy or the fertile times or any other things that they need. And then finally, I saw the lack of legal documentation. So they usually, because the requirement of new IDs, they were required to go through a process that also have a cost, like economic cost. And also it was only being done through the internet. So there were a lot of steps for people from Venezuela to follow in order to have this new documentation that wasn't required before. So many people, to see that that process was something that they could not do, they decided to walk through other border lines where there were any requirement of legal documentation, but in some points in those border lines without any legal requirement, you will see, or they will face also different criminal groups that will ask them to pay some monetary compensation just to cross the border. Then daily mobility and border is the movement between border cities that play the role of hosting workspace, education centers, grocery shops, medical centers, and pharmacies, which allow the migratory groups to move to other places and bring back to their hometowns the basic elements needed by them. So as I say before, Venezuela had a crisis on medicines, and that crisis was mainly being solved by the Colombian borderline, which is a city called Cucuta. So in Cucuta, they had these big shops where people from Venezuela were able to go and buy all these things as grocery or medical elements that they needed and bring it back home to people that were in need of it. Or we will see other people also going to Colombia to buy those things and go back to Venezuela to sell them for a higher price. Just because of the mobility, right? So with this, I saw 36 articles with this idea of daily border mobility. And mainly I saw the border closures, which affected the same day mobilizations. As I say, people from Venezuela worked in Colombia, and people from Colombia also had daily things to do in Venezuela. With this border closure, those constant relations, which are very healthy, were violated, and they start facing new crises. Border cities as Cucuta are this focus of those transnational relations. Shopping for goods movements. So, well, in 2015, there was the first closure of the border by the Venezuelan state because of the unlikely equal political relations. The Colombian state start working with the Venezuelan state to allow people from Venezuela to come to Colombia and have like a day of buying goods in Colombia. So this movement was done 3 or 4 times during the 5 years of period. And then people were able to go in one day to Colombia, buy goods and come back. And that was just done in 4 days during those 5 years. So it's not like they were able to do every day. And this was a huge process that the Colombian state had to go with the Venezuelan state, trying to think not only on their political affiliations or not affiliations, but on the wealth of the people. So with this idea of sister nations, is that Venezuela and Colombia, they are also they were at first historically they were one country, and they were called La Gran Colombia, also with Ecuador and Panama. And this idea of, well, we were one whole country, no long ago, why we cannot keep like treating ourselves like sister nations. And these also have represented the Colombian to Venezuela migration on the last century, as well. Venezuela opened their arms for Colombians to migrate, but now that is the turn of Colombia to open their arms, there has been somewhat like that idea of, yes, we are sister nations, but not that much, right? In these pictures, we can see, this shirt that he is wearing the Venezuelan t-shirt of any soccer team. But what is important is that while he's crossing the border here, he's having the two flags of Colombia and Venezuela sewed together. So it's that idea again of, okay, we are sister nations, so what are we doing to help our brothers and sisters that are in need? So in the micro scale, there was some acceptation with this idea of sister nations. Therefore, I want to help, we want to help, let's help, how can we help? And but there was also some exclusion of, well, they're coming to take our jobs, they are coming to take our husbands, or these women are coming to work in these many things that we don't want our community to see, right? So in that sense of relation of Venezuelans moving to Colombia, the economic increase of 60% in the sales of border cities was something that possibly affected Colombian cities in a positive way. Well, the newspapers were portraying it more as, oh, they are taking all our goods and bringing it to Venezuela. But the newspapers didn't present like, oh, we are reaching a very good level of economy because of these sales. The other thing that I saw here was that migrants are being exploited and advertising as a hook. And this is due to, in that time period of 2015 to 2022, during 2017 and 2018, Colombia was part of the presidential elections, and many president candidates were looking at Venezuelans and saying like, if you don't want to be like Venezuela, vote for this candidate. Or if you want to have less Venezuelans, vote for this candidate. Or if you want to help Venezuelans, vote for this candidate. So like that idea of the Venezuelan crisis as an advertisement of the political affiliations of many different candidates in Colombia were also something that were like look here in this analysis. And then we see refugees houses for Venezuelans in Colombia. I saw here two main refugees. The first one was a Venezuelan Colombian couple, which create a refugee called Pana workers. In this refugee didn't have any requirements for the people to stay, and it was mainly a community built refugee. And they, in one night, they got up to 280 people that include men, women, children, and elderly in one only night. Well, there is another refugee that is the state refugee, the refugee that USA also helped with monetary aid to build. And this refugee cost 1,000 million of pesos. Colombian pesos, sorry, and had a limit of 240 people per day, but they had an 8-hour shift limit. So people will be able to be in this refugee just for 8 hours. And they had a requirement to enter the refugee. They had to show that they had like transportation tickets to go to other city, or that they were having another housing place to arrive at. Like they weren't, it wasn't an open refugee for anyone without any requirement as the Pana workers. So here is also this construct between how the social mobilization of Colombian Venezuelan people that are in a good space and place in Colombia that help the community constructs with the Colombian state, and how the Colombian state, with the many resources and aid help from USA, limit their services to the migrant community. And so then the second category is perception of Venezuelan women's sexuality. So gender influence the migratory realities for women, as already explained, by different ways, such as family, education, work, health, and more. So the news media are playing a role of reproducing the perceptions of Venezuelan women's sexuality in different ways. And they portrayed this Venezuelan woman's sexuality as an important identity for the Venezuelan woman. But they didn't recognize that the Venezuelan woman has many other things that are part of her or their identity. Women in Venezuela are facing aspects that makes their mobilization a difficult process, such as economic necessity, ignorance of the local spaces, time pressure, disease, carrying responsibilities that were left at their place of origin, and sometimes even like the lack of the knowledge of the language. Even though Colombia and Venezuela, they speak Spanish, there are indigenous communities, as the Wayúus, that they are also migrating from Venezuela to Colombia, and many of them sometimes don't have Spanish as the main language, but they have their native language as the main language. So there can be also that problematic. So in this part, I saw 28 articles, where 13 articles focus mainly on pregnancy, and 15 articles focus mainly on prostitution. And so in this picture, we can see, well, I have to cut it a little bit, but they are presenting a Venezuelan woman that is seated in a bed that is underground, that is in a ground that is mainly sand, and around it there is not walls, there is not a house, it's just a place where they have a bed. And then they are showing this woman that is trying to make a control on the pregnant woman. So those little pictures do have their own discourse, and in this case they are presenting the Venezuelan woman as a victim of not only of the Venezuelan state, but also they are starting to present it as a victim of the Colombian state. But at the same time, they are presenting the Colombian state as the savior by having this woman taking care of it, right? So the nationality being used in the newspapers to discriminate the Venezuelan women's pregnancies. So usually the main headlines were these many Venezuelan women are coming pregnant to Colombia to have babies, and they were using their state and their nationality as something that was criminal, and they start like criminalizing their nationality and their state. So emphasis on the millions of Colombian pesos that were used to solve the dissipation created by the high numbers of pregnancy cases. So usually also these headlines were like, for example, here we see Cartagena clinic bill 3 million of pesos for Venezuelan deliveries. Well, there is a higher number of Colombian deliveries, right? But they are not presenting it as, well, from, I don't know, let's say 12 billion of Colombian pesos, just 3 billion were guided to solve Venezuelan pregnancies. They are making people to understand like, oh, wow, we are wasting so much money on Venezuelan pregnancies. They are just coming here to have babies, right? The idea of Venezuelan women traveling to Colombia only to have kids, as can be seen in different articles. The newspaper links poverty with pregnancy and migration, as I already explained here in the picture. 14% of the pregnant women have zero prenatal controls, what is a result of the poor health system in Venezuela, but has also an impact on the Colombian economic system, because the Colombian health system had to look for those women that didn't have any prenatal controls in Venezuela, and usually they had moved to Colombia with already some months of pregnancy. So the health department was very worried that for the life of the mother and the kid. So those were like high headlines that were showing on these newspapers. And the lack of contraceptive methods in Venezuela has forced women to carry out the sterilization process, such as fallopian tube ligation, that will help them to control the birth rate within the country. So this was another idea of the Venezuelan women are coming to Colombia to have this process done. So we are wasting so much time on them. Well, there are so many women in Colombia that are from Colombia that need also the same process. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Yeah. So then the second one was Venezuelan women's sexual work. So women that migrate for work often in feminine positions, they usually get jobs as nannies, as maid, as confectioner, prostitute, escort, mother, dancer, teacher, nurse, and many other these feminine positions of work. So they usually encounter underpaid positions, and this is due not only because of their gender of as a woman, but also because of their state as a woman. And again, let's remember that idea of me as a Venezuelan woman that has migrated to Colombia. I have the border in me, therefore people will treat me in a different way than they will treat a Colombian woman. The gender structure environment is constantly limiting the oppositions and opportunities for migrant women. And this is due to the idea of women being good only to work in some things, but not good enough to work in many other things. So in many headlines, they were selling these imaginaries of Venezuelan women that only migrated for and to work in sexual jobs, but they were not recognizing the other jobs that Venezuelan women were doing, such as teachers, for example, or nurses or caregivers. And this idea of selling the Venezuelan women and their job as only like into the lines of sexual jobs had also influence on the perception of Colombian society to the Venezuelan women. So the Colombian government was always also some of the articles that here were presented was that the Colombian government was carrying out those sexual works and places, but they were mainly going to take the Venezuelan women that were working without papers out of the country, but they were looking for the people that have brought the Venezuelan woman from Venezuela to work on those things. So this also creates this discourse of illegal prostitution networks, the use of drugs, weapons, and underage prostitution, and this idea of work documents were all guided always as and used as a way of criminalizing the Venezuelan woman, but not as a way of criticizing what is the state, the Colombian state doing wrong there. Here I have some numbers. So 22,758 sex workers in Colombia, which is 37% of migrants who are between, in that moment, 18 and 25 years old, and 54% finish high school, and 33% of them, they finish the university. So we can see that in these percentages, there is not a desire to work as sexual workers, but it's a need that, or in so many cases, they were enforced to work on those things, but they didn't want to. Also, because of the lack of legal documentation, many women that had other professions only find prostitution or sexual jobs as the only source to bring back home some of the money and the earnings. So the Venezuelan woman worker is presented as the victim of human and economic crisis in Venezuela. As I say, work in prostitution to be able to send money back in Venezuela. And the Colombian state was afraid of the sexual transmitted disease by the Venezuelan workers. And this was being shown in many articles where it says like SIDA has grow the percentage of people because or due to the high level of Venezuelan sexual workers, or these many Venezuelan sexual workers have this disease, and be careful. And those discourses of Venezuelan women are the only ones carrying that, were the types of discourses that I was looking at in this Venezuelan women's sexual work. So the last funding is violence encountered by Venezuelan women. And here I see gender and migration process as something that combined in an oppression towards that Venezuelan woman. And then violence against migrant women can occur in any stage of their migratory process. And I saw here 26 articles. And in these articles, I saw topics such as sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, feminicides, and verbal abuse. So sexual exploitation, I saw 18 articles where Venezuelan women were because of their social economic context, they were being taken from Venezuela and being brought to Colombia with these ideas of they are going to be working in other things, but they are not going to be working in sexual work. But once they migrated to Colombia, they were their passports were taken from them, and they were required to work as sexual workers. And Venezuelan woman then lives in a constant violation of her rights because of it. Many other things of like sexual exploitation was that the Venezuelan woman was a victim that was violated violated for being a migrant well in her path of migration. And many articles were showing these many Venezuelan women were violated, and it's just because they are migrants, so there is not too much to do, there is no control that we can do. Then migratory process that leaves a sequel that remind them of their traumatic experience, not only experiences that were lived once they arrived to Colombia, but the also traumatic experience that were lived in Venezuela and during their migration process. So in Colombia, of 100% of sexual workers, 35.7% are from other nationality. This means that it's not only Venezuelan women, the ones that are working as sex workers. But we have to understand that sexual exploitation is being sought and punished by the state. So in this picture, for example, is one of the pictures of the many articles that I was looking at, and we can see that mainly they are focusing the women that are being sexually exploited, but they are not focusing the men that were consuming that sexual exploitation, right? And again, in these articles, the discourse was these many Venezuelan women undocumented were taken from this house, and they were brought back to Venezuela. But there was any discourse of saying this has happening, this organization was shutting down, and we took these many Colombian people or even Venezuelan people that had Venezuelan women under sexual exploitation. But like the discourse was more always guided to Venezuelan women equal they are the bad guy, but also they are the victims, right? And there was not any conclusion of Colombian state criminalizing the people that was taking these women without their willing. So again, Venezuelan woman is being framed as a victim of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and sexual work. And always the Colombian police was presented as heroes, which is very interesting due to the fact that they were not going to arrest or to criminalize those people that have the Venezuelan woman against their will. Then we have feminicides. In this, I saw 5 articles, which one article called my attention. And
Laura?
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You have one more minute.
Okay.
Many of us have to go to other meetings afterwards. Just wanted to let you know. Sorry about that.
Yes, sorry. Okay, so feminicides is interesting that women here do not have the 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 solvency on how state looked for the criminal or the person that killed the woman. But there was always this discourse of because they are Venezuelan, they are sex workers, or they are migrants that are walking the streets. That's why they were killed, but not a discourse of we are still looking for the people or the person that killed these women. There was always a victimization, but also a criminalization of the Venezuelan woman. So my conclusions are that Venezuelan women search for opportunity, that perception of migrants as a threat to the society, and the Colombian state represent always as a hero. The use of Venezuelan migration as a humanitarian crisis to have more international aid, and then the perception of Venezuelan women's sexuality, always trying to limit the Venezuelan woman's sexuality into pregnancies, into they want to take from the state all as they can, and then also as sexual workers. And finally, the violence encountered by Venezuelan women was always guided to criminalize them, but not to solve the problematic. Yep, thank you.
Amazing, thank you. I know personally I learned a lot. As you can see, that was an amazing presentation. Like I said, many of us have to run to another meeting. Is there a way for us to, like I said, like this is really interesting, like to follow your work, to follow your research?
Yes, so I am currently working on my dissertation, right? So my dissertation will also be based on Venezuelan women's and their migration path. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I can share my contact info here, and we can talk that way.
Thank you everyone for attending. Please contact Laura to follow up. This is, like I said, really, really informative. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Laura.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Sorry, I have to run off to a meeting now.
Bye.
Bye.